In 1958, 19-year-old Charles Starkweather was desperate. Desperate to marry his jailbait girlfriend, desperate to make some money for himself so he wouldn't be broke every day of his life, desperate to get out of the Nebraska town where everyone had figured him for a loser. He and Carol Fugate embarked on a murder spree that horrified the country. This was the country that had elected Eisenhower and Nixon for a second term in 1956, and where the FBI's J. Edgar Hoover was firmly entrenched as the national policeman. This was also a country that was undergoing unsettling cultural changes. Frightening and offensive symbols of rebellion emerged and thrived. Elvis Presley, James Dean, and the whole rock and roll culture focused on a new generation that challenged the status quo of the sterile 1950s. The country that uncomfortably watched James Dean's Rebel Without a Cause in 1956 suddenly saw a Dean-like figure in Charles Starkweather to make them really uncomfortable. What was the world coming to? Were the violence and the alienation of Starkweather just the beginning of some uncontrollable trend that would destroy the fabric of society? Perhaps, but it would take longer than anyone expected. The cinematic embodiments of the Starkweather murder spree took a long time to hit the market and did not take hold as a genre for over 35 years. By then, Starkweather and Fugate are merely smudged antecedents, unrecognizable as direct characters, present only in their angst and isolation. This frightening rebel twosome inspired a whole series of mainstream and not-so-mainstream movies like the 1974 Badlands of Terrence Malick, Wild at Heart by David Lynch, Quentin Tarantino, and Tony Scott's 1993 True Romance, Dominic Sena's 1993 California, and Oliver Stone's 1994 Natural Born Killers. Charlie Starkweather was born into a poor, uneducated but hard-working family in Lincoln, Nebraska, on November 24, 1938. He was the third of 7 children that Guy and Helen Starkweather would have. Despite the Depression years in which he and his siblings were born, they never went without food or shelter. They were poor, but it did not stop Charlie from having a decent childhood and good memories of the things his family did together. Their community considered the Starkweather children well-behaved. William Allen in Starkweather describes Guy as a handsome and talkative man who was better suited for white-collar work than the carpenter's trade that he had chosen. He didn't have the necessary physical stamina, and because of various ailments, including a weak back and arthritis, did not work regularly. Helen, a small woman with frizzy red hair, was strong and kind, the one who held things together. She worked as a waitress to augment the limited family income. While Charlie's early childhood memories are very pleasant, his school experiences were traumatic for him. The comfort he felt in his family's surroundings vanished in the classroom. The children laughed at his minor speech impediment and teased him about his bowed legs. Even though Charlie was of average intelligence, he never applied himself and was considered a slow learner. One sure contributor to his problems, which went undetected until he was 15, was his severe myopia. He couldn't even read the largest letter on the eye chart. One of the only subjects in which he excelled was the gym. He was well coordinated and strong. His gymnastic abilities were the only legitimate source of self-esteem that he had. The flip side of the coin was that he used those same physical abilities to fight on a continuous basis with the other boys in the school. He blamed all of his fights on being made fun of as a child. Sometimes his battles were brief outbursts of violence, but other times they were frenzied and prolonged, not ending until they were broken up or his opponent lay senseless. He earned a reputation for being one of the meanest, toughest kids in Lincoln. In the 9th grade, he met Bob Von Bush, who, after Charlie fought with him, became one of his closest friends. Bob said of him, "He could be the kindest person you've ever seen. He'd do anything for you if he liked you. He was a hell of a lot of fun to be around, too. Everything was just one big joke to him, but he had this other side. He could be mean as hell, cruel. If he saw some poor guy on the street who was bigger than he was, better looking or better dressed, he'd try to take the poor bastard down to his size." Both of the boys were James Dean fanatics. They saw all of his movies. There was no question that Charlie tried to imitate Dean's mannerisms, clothes and hairstyle, tight jeans and cowboy boots. But Charlie was no James Dean in looks, brains or talent. He was a very flawed imitation. What was genuine in Charlie, however, was the isolation and rebellion that Dean perfected in his talented characterizations. Jack Sargent in Born Bad sees Starkweather in his autobiography, which Starkweather aptly titled Rebellion, revealed as acutely sensitive, not just to the taunts of his fellow students, but also to his family's low social position and poverty. For Starkweather, poverty was a trap. He could map its confines and trace its borders, but Charles could see no escape for himself. He believed that his very life was rigidly controlled. He saw that he would not be able to flee the bludgeoning poverty that had characterized his working-class childhood, but instead would be condemned to repeat it, eventually finding himself in a manual job, a wife, having children, and then simply dying. Charlie's close buddy Bob Von Busch began to date Barbara Fugate in 1956. Charlie eventually became interested in Barbara's younger sister Carol, who had just turned 13. The four of them double-dated on a steady basis, despite Carol's youth. Carol was a pretty girl with dark brown hair and a ready smile. She too had a wide streak of rebellion in her and a mercurial temper. She was not much of a scholar and had failed a grade in elementary school. Even though her teachers considered her a slow learner, Charlie thought she was a wizard. He treated her like a goddess, and probably because she was so young, she thought he was really cool and had no appreciation for his serious weaknesses. William Allen states, "She was impressed by his cars, his toughness, his looks, and despite his poverty, the way he could give her almost anything she wanted." Charlie said that Carol meant more to him than anything had before. Without her, he would be thrust back into the world he hated so much. Carol almost even made him stop hating himself. He saw himself as reflected in her eyes, and he looked good. Charlie quit school at the age of 16 and went to work loading and unloading trucks at the Western Newspaper Union warehouse. His boss didn't think much of Charlie. Sometimes you'd have to tell him something 2 or 3 times. Of all the employees in the warehouse, he was the dumbest man we had. The warehouse was near the school Carol attended, so he could see her every day. He taught her how to drive, even though she was too young to drive legally. One day, Carol took Charlie's hot rod and got into a minor accident. Charlie's father was part owner of the car and had to pay for the damages to the other vehicle, an event that caused a huge argument between the two men. The argument became physical, and Charlie was told to find somewhere else to live. Charlie moved into the rooming house where his friends Bob and Barbara Fugate, then Bob's wife, lived. Now that the relationship with his parents was very strained, Carol became the center of Charlie's life. He began telling people that he and Carol were getting married. Then he started telling his friends that Carol was pregnant with his child, a lie that backfired when Carol's parents heard it. Charlie quit his job at the paper company and started to work as a garbage man. It was hardly a career enhancement, but he did it so that he could be off work when she was through with school. The pay was only $42 a week, not enough to support himself, let alone Carol. His landlady was unsympathetic and locked him out until he came up with the rent he owed her. Charlie began to see himself as trapped in a life of poverty. With his limited intellect, the only way out that he could envision was to do something really dramatic like robbing a bank. Every day on his route, collecting the garbage from across town, where the middle and upper classes of Lincoln, Nebraska lived, he saw what he was being excluded from. While heaving heavy, stinking sacks of trash for a minimum wage, Starkweather came to the realization that for him there was one great leveler of class, one way in which he would find himself equal with the rest of society which had oppressed, dominated, and alienated him, a method by which he would find retribution. Dead people are all on the same level. Gradually, Charlie convinced himself that he was going to have to lead a life of crime to get the money and respect he craved. Just the day before, he had wanted to buy a stuffed toy dog for Carol at the gas station and realized that he didn't even have enough money for that. Even worse, the gas station attendant refused to let him buy the toy on credit. He would get back at these people who turned their noses down at him. He really would. It was well below zero, and the raw Nebraska winds were whipping around mercilessly on that first day of December 1957. It was almost 3 a.m., time to begin what he needed to do. He took with him the 12-gauge shotgun he had lifted from Bob von Bush's cousin and the shells that he had just bought for it, and drove to the gas station that had refused him credit. Robert Culvert, the 21-year-old who had humiliated Charlie the day before, was on duty at the station by himself. He was a short, slender man with a young wife and a baby on the way. Culvert was working on a carburetor when Charlie came into the filling station. He sold him a pack of Camels, and Charlie drove off. A few minutes later, Charlie turned the car around and went back to the station. Culvert was still behind the counter. This time, Charlie bought a pack of gum, got into his car, and drove off again. He parked close by and put on his disguise, a bandana tied over much of his face and a hunter's hat to cover his red hair. Then Charlie walked back into the station with the loaded shotgun and a canvas bag for the loot. By this time, Culvert was back working on the car and didn't even know anyone was there until he felt the shotgun jabbed into his back. Charlie marched Culvert back to the office and made him open the cash drawer. Charlie scooped up the money and put it in the canvas bag. "Open up the safe," he ordered, but Culvert didn't have the combination. Only the boss knew the combination. Charlie accepted that explanation and decided that he'd just have to make do with the $100 or so that was in the cash drawer. Charlie decided that Culvert was going for a ride. He made the terrified station attendant drive them out toward Bloody Mary's house. Bloody Mary was a crazy old woman who fired a shotgun full of rock salt at anybody who trespassed on her property. Then Charlie made Culvert get out of the car. Later, Charlie said that Culvert struggled with him for the gun and was shot in the scuffle. However, as Culvert tried to get up on his hands and knees, Charlie shot him again, right in the skull. The newspapers made the murder and robbery into a major news event, since there was so little serious crime in that area then. Starkweather took the precaution of painting his car a different color, but then he did some dumb things that called attention to him as a suspect. It was widely reported that most of the loot from the gas station hold-up was in coins, but Charlie used change to buy some clothing for himself. The authorities believed that the hold-up and murder were committed by a transient, so the pressure was off Charlie for the time being. The murder gave Starkweather a feeling of euphoria and peace. He had money. He had a girl. He had killed and not been bothered by it. It gave him an enormous feeling of power. He now operated outside the laws of man. He felt as if he were invisible, could do just as he pleased, take what he wanted. The law was helpless against him. The day after he robbed the gas station and murdered Robert Culvert, Charlie admitted to Carol that he held up the gas station, but that someone else had shot Culvert. She was not fooled, he told people later. The killing created a bond between them that sealed their fate. He seemed to understand that this time together was all that they would have in life before the end. He could grab anything he wanted to give Carol, and the two of them could enjoy that life for at least a little while before their time ran out. It didn't matter that their time was probably very short. What mattered was that they had this time together at all. When the euphoria wore off, Charlie was left with some grim realities. He had been fired from his job as a garbageman. His landlady had locked him out in the freezing cold because he was past due on his rent. Both his family and Carol's family were completely against their relationship and did everything they could to break it up. Carol had put on a little weight, and her family was sure that she was pregnant. He was desperate. On Tuesday afternoon, January 21st, 1958, Starkweather drove over to the squalid dump that Carol and her family called home. The house and the yard were strewn with litter and unused construction materials. Charlie took the .22 caliber rifle he had borrowed and some ammunition to the back door and knocked. Carol's mother, Velda Bartlett, came to the door. What really happened afterward is impossible to confirm. This account is based on Starkweather's recollections after the fact. He claimed that he was carrying the rifle and ammunition in hopes that he could go hunting with Carol's stepfather, Marion Bartlett, with the goal of repairing their relationship. He also brought along 2 discarded carpet samples he found for Velda. According to Charlie, Velda and Marion were both in the house. Their 2.5-year-old child, Betty Jean, was crying. Velda told Charlie they did not want him to see Carol anymore. A loud argument followed, and Velda allegedly hit Charlie a couple of times. He claimed that he left the house without the rifle and drove around for a while before he came back to get the gun. When he came back again, Marion Bartlett literally kicked him out of the door. Starkweather went to a payphone, called Marion Bartlett's place of employment, and told them that he was ill and would not be at work for a couple of days. Then he went back to Carol's house and waited for her to come home from school. When Charlie told Carol what had happened with her parents, she went into the house and argued with her mother. Starkweather followed her into the house. He said that Velda began hitting him again, shrieking that he had made Carol pregnant. He hit Velda back, and they struggled for a few minutes before Charlie got his gun. At that moment, Marion Bartlett came into the room, allegedly with a claw hammer in his hand, and Starkweather shot him in the head. Then Charlie claimed that Velda came at him with a huge knife. Starkweather shot her in the face. As if that was not enough, he rammed the butt of the rifle into her head a couple of times when she tried to get up to reach her baby. Then Charlie hit the baby with the rifle butt. Starkweather said, "I picked up that knife that the old lady had, started to walk into the bedroom, and the little girl kept yelling and I told her to shut up, and I started to walk again and just turned around and threw the kitchen knife I had at her. They said it hit her in the throat, but I thought it hit her in the chest. I went on into the bedroom. Mr. Bartlett was moving around, so I tried to stab him in the throat, but the knife wouldn't go in, and I just hit the top part of it with my hand, and it went in." Carol's reaction to and role in this slaughter was never satisfactorily determined. Since the only 2 living witnesses were Charlie and Carol, the real truth may never be known. Carol claimed that she had broken up with Charlie before these tragic events and was terrorized while he attacked her family. What happened after the murder of her family defies belief. Velda's body was dragged to the old outhouse and shoved down the toilet opening. Carol's baby half-sister was put in a box that had been used for garbage and taken out to the outhouse as well. Marion Bartlett was dumped on the floor of the chicken coop. Once that was done, Carol and Charlie cleaned up the blood and mess inside and spent the rest of the evening drinking Pepsi and eating potato chips. They stayed there in the house, just a few yards away from the rotting corpses of Carol's family, for almost a week, buying milk and bread on credit from the milkman every day. Charlie would go down to the grocery store to buy a few other essentials. In the days after the murders, a number of visitors came by the house. Carol turned most of them away with a sign on the front door saying, "Stay away, everybody is sick with the flu." One day, Marion Bartlett's boss came to the door to see just how sick he was, but Carol came out and told him that her father was still very sick and bedridden. Then, Carol's sister Barbara von Busch and her husband came to visit, but Carol discouraged them both with the story about the flu. They were both suspicious, and later Bob von Busch came back with his brother to investigate. This time the story had changed. In tears, Carol told them they had to leave. "Please don't try to get in. Mom's life will be in your hands if you do." The von Busch brothers went to the police. Later the police showed up and were told by Carol that the family had the flu. When the police asked why her brother-in-law would call the police, Carol told them that Bob von Busch did not get along well with her family. Since Carol seemed sincere and credible and not in any danger, they left. Later, the von Busches were told that there was no reason for alarm. Bob and Barbara sent over one of Carol's close friends, who heard a third story. Carol told her friend in a low whisper, "Some guy is back there with Chuck. He has a Tommy gun. I think they're going to rob a bank." The friend didn't tell the von Busches, but did tell her father, who called the police the next day. Pansy, Carol's grandmother, came over to her daughter's house. Carol seemed to know that her grandmother wasn't going to fall for the flu story, so she embroidered one of the other stories she had made up. "Go home, Grandma. Oh, Granny, go away. Mummy's life is in danger if you don't." Pansy became angry that Carol wouldn't let her in. "If you don't open this door this second, I'm going to go to town and get a search warrant. You've got Chuck in there with you, and don't try to tell me you don't." Carol refused to let her in, and Pansy went to the police. Finally, the police, at Pansy's insistence, made a cursory look inside the house, even though they didn't have a warrant. The house was empty. The police were satisfied that there seemed to be no sign of disorder or violence inside the house. Later that day, Bob von Busch demanded that the police make a thorough search of the property, but they refused. Meanwhile, Guy Starkweather had been trying to get the police to pick up his son for questioning, but he too was refused. Bob von Busch and his brother went out to the Bartlett house and searched the property on their own. One look inside the outhouse and the chicken coop confirmed their worst fears. This time the police paid him some attention. The police bulletin went out to pick up Charlie Starkweather and Carol Fugate. What the police did not appreciate was that this was just the second act of this escalating drama. Once Starkweather and Carol realized that they had better skip town, they also understood that Charlie's car was not going to take them very far. For one thing, the tires were shot. Charlie tried to repair the worst one before they left, but the repair didn't hold, and soon they were looking for a garage. One place they could find temporary refuge was Charlie's 72-year-old family friend, August Meyer. By all accounts, August Meyer was a kindly old bachelor who had known Charlie since he was a boy. Meyer had a farm some 20 miles outside Lincoln where Charlie used to hunt. On January 27th, they pulled onto the dirt track that led to Meyer's farm and immediately got mired in the mud. It is hard to say why exactly, since Carol and Charlie's stories were very contradictory and unsatisfactory, but Charlie shot August Meyer in the head. As in the other murders, Charlie unconvincingly claimed that the killing occurred in self-defense. According to Charlie, Meyer tried to shoot him, and the gun jammed, so Charlie shot back. Then Charlie wounded Meyer's dog as it ran away across the snowy meadow. Charlie carried the body of his old friend into an outbuilding and hid it with a blanket. Then he and Carol went into Meyer's home, stole his money and guns, ate his food, and fell asleep. The next day, a neighbor helped them free their car from the mud, and they drove up to Meyer's farm on a different road. When Charlie checked on the body of his friend, he was spooked by the fact that the blanket was suddenly gone. Fearing discovery, Charlie and Carol took their car down the path in which they first got stuck in the mud. Not surprisingly, the intellectually challenged couple got stuck once again. Taking only their weapons, they left the old Ford where it was. Hiding their shotguns, the two of them hitched a ride from 17-year-old Robert Jensen and 16-year-old Carol King. Within moments, the shotgun was at Jensen's neck, and Charlie was demanding their money. He forced Jensen to drive back towards Meyer's farm to an abandoned storm cellar. There he put 6 bullets into Jensen's head. Jensen's girlfriend, Carol King, was shot once in the head. Her body was left half naked, with her jeans and panties down around her ankles. She had been stabbed repeatedly in the abdomen and pubic area, but there was no evidence of semen in or around her vagina. While all of this was happening, Carol allegedly was sitting in the car. Charlie attributed the mutilation of King's body to Carol, who supposedly was angry with the dead girl for being attractive sexually to Starkweather. At another time, Charlie claimed that Carol also shot and killed the King girl when he was away from the scene for a few minutes. The bodies of the 2 teenagers were left in the storm cellar while Charlie and Carol took off with Jensen's car. Even though they talked about escaping to Washington State to find refuge with Charlie's brother, they actually did something incredibly dumb. They drove back to Lincoln where everybody knew them and everybody was looking for them. As if that were not stupid enough, they drove past the Bartlett home to see if the bodies of Carol's parents had been discovered. They got their answer when they saw all of the police cars parked around the property. Eventually they drove to the most affluent section of town and fell asleep in their stolen car. The following day, January 28, 1958, Starkweather's car had been spotted in the mud at the Meyer farm. Shortly afterward, the bodies of Meyer and the two teenagers were found. A major manhunt was underway, but there was more killing yet to come. Despite his poverty, Charlie was very familiar with the best part of town from his garbage-collecting days. He chose the large home of C. Lauer Ward, a 47-year-old close friend of the governor and president of the Capitol Bridge and Capitol Steel Companies. That morning, Clara Ward, the industrialist's socially prominent wife, and Lillian Fenkel, their hard-of-hearing 51-year-old maid, were home, as were their Chesapeake Bay retriever, Queenie, and their small poodle, Susie. When Lillian Fenkel answered the door, Charlie pointed his gun at her. Carol stayed in the car. He ordered Lillian to lock up Queenie in the basement. Recognizing that the maid had a hearing problem, he wrote her notes to make himself understood. He told her to keep making breakfast for Mrs. Ward. When Clara Ward came into the kitchen, Charlie assured her that nothing bad would happen. Clara was calm and agreed to cooperate. Charlie had Carol come into the house where Mrs. Ward had fixed some coffee for her. Then Carol went into the library and fell asleep. Charlie ordered Clara Ward to fix him some pancakes and serve them to him in the library. When she did so, he changed his mind and had her fix him waffles instead. Still, Mrs. Ward kept her cool and was gracious to Charlie all the while. He exulted in his accomplishment. One of the wealthiest residents of Lincoln was waiting on him, the former garbage man. Around 1 p.m., Clara Ward asked permission to go upstairs and change her shoes. After a few minutes, Charlie went upstairs to see what was keeping her. He claimed that she had armed herself with a .22, shot at him and missed. Charlie threw a knife at her and struck her in the back. He stabbed her repeatedly in the neck and chest. As he dragged Clara's body into the bedroom, Susie started barking at him, so he broke her neck with the butt end of the gun. After killing Clara Ward, Starkweather called his father and told his father to tell Bob von Busch that he was going to kill him for interfering with Charlie's relationship with Carol. Then he sat down to write a letter that was addressed to the law only. It was a twisted, illiterate tirade, confession, and attempt at self-justification. I and Carol are sorry for what has happened because it has hurt everybody, and so has Carol. But I'm saying one thing. Everybody that came out there was lucky they're not dead, even Carol's sister. Later, the two of them loaded the Ward's black 1956 Packard with food and prepared to escape in style. They ransacked the house, taking anything that looked valuable. Around 5:30 p.m., the Lincoln Journal arrived, and Charlie was thrilled. "Hey, Carol, get a load of this. We're stars. Made the front page of the Journal." He had reached his zenith. He was somebody to be reckoned with. A half-hour later, C. Lauer Ward came home from work to face the barrel of Starkweather's gun. After a long scuffle, Charlie finally got the upper hand and shot the industrialist dead. Then he turned on Lillian Fenkel. Carol and Charlie tied her to a bed and stabbed her to death. Charlie claimed that Carol killed the maid, while Carol claimed that Charlie did it. Refreshingly, Charlie didn't try to justify the killing this time by claiming the maid attacked him. The next day, Ward's cousin and business associate missed him at work and called the house throughout the morning. Then, around noontime, he went over to the house and let himself in. He found the bodies of Ward and his wife and the maid. Downstairs, Queenie barked furiously, and upstairs, Susie cowered under the bed with a broken neck. Governor Anderson was notified immediately of the savage attack on his friend. Shortly afterward, he called out the National Guard, and they were soon cruising the streets with jeeps armed with mounted machine guns. Parents with guns drawn rushed to the schools and took their children home. The city was completely sealed off. A block-by-block search began. The FBI started an investigation. A $1,000 reward was offered by the mayor. Aircraft were sent up to help look for the Ward's black Packard. And where did these clever outlaws run? Why, back to Carol's parents' house, of course. Yes, they really did. But wisely, they didn't go inside because there was a car in the driveway and the house was lighted up. Somehow, they finally got the message that they could not go back and live at the Bartlett house anymore and headed west towards Washington State. They drove all night and crossed over into Wyoming the next morning, the 29th of January 1958. Twice they were reported to the police as acting suspiciously, but nothing came of either report. Along the way, they looked for a car to steal and finally came across Merle Collison, a traveling Montana shoe salesman who was sleeping in his Buick parked along the highway. Charlie woke up the salesman to announce that they were going to trade cars, but the shoe salesman apparently didn't agree quickly enough because Charlie shot him a number of times in the head, neck, arm and leg. Since it was a tough stretch of the imagination to expect anyone to believe that Charlie shot Merle Collison in self-defense, Charlie said that Carol did it. With Collison dead in the front passenger seat and Carol in the back, Starkweather started the car but could not figure out how to release the emergency brake. A few minutes later, a young geologist stopped to help the couple, figuring that they had car trouble. "Raise your hands," Charlie told the man, pointing the gun at him. "Help me release the emergency brake or I'll kill you." When the geologist saw the dead man slumped in the passenger seat, he realized that he would have to get the gun away from Starkweather if he wanted to stay alive. While they were struggling, William Romer, a Wyoming deputy sheriff, came by and stopped. Immediately, Carol jumped out of the back seat and ran up to Romer. "Take me to the police," she cried. "Well, I'm a deputy sheriff," he assured her. "He's killed a man," she blurted out, crying and pointing to the car. By this time, Charlie had run to the Packard and was driving back towards the town of Douglas. Romer ordered a roadblock and began his pursuit. Douglas Police Chief Robert Ainsley, who happened to be in his car with Sheriff Earl Heflin of Converse County, Wyoming, received Romer's call. When the Packard raced by them on the road to Douglas, the two men chased it at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. Heflin shot out the back window of the Packard with his carbine. Suddenly, Starkweather came to an abrupt halt right in the middle of the highway. The two seasoned lawmen pulled up behind the Packard cautiously and waited until Starkweather got out. They told Charlie to put his hands up, but he didn't, so Ainsley shot the ground near Charlie's feet. This time, Ainsley told him to lie down on the ground, but instead, Charlie reached behind his pants. Thinking that Charlie was reaching for a weapon in his back pocket, Ainsley shot at him again. By this time, Charlie decided to stop tucking in his shirt tail and lay down like he was told to. Why did he suddenly stop? Because he thought he had been shot. In actuality, the bleeding around his ear was a cut from the broken window glass. Heflin was disgusted. He thought he was bleeding to death. That's why he stopped. That's the kind of yellow son of a bitch he is. Yellow or not, he photographed well in a Hollywood kind of way. Bloodied, in chains, shaggy-haired, a cigarette dangling from his lips, wearing his black leather motorcycle jacket, tight black denim pants, blue and white cowboy boots with a butterfly design on the toes, he was a perfect-looking young rebel killer. The first American teenage spree killer caught on camera. From Charlie's perspective, his options were not terribly attractive. He believed that he could go to the gas chamber in Wyoming for the murder of Merle Collison, or he could go to the electric chair in Nebraska for his many killings there. He chose Nebraska, and he and Carol were extradited at the end of January 1958. What he didn't know, and nobody thought to tell him, was that, had he stayed in Wyoming, he probably would have received a life sentence. The Wyoming governor was a death penalty opponent. Carol, meanwhile, maintained that she was a hostage throughout the entire ordeal and that she kept going with Charlie because she feared that he would kill her family if she didn't. The only problem with that story was that she admitted being present for all of the Nebraska murders, including her parents and half-sister. So much for going with Charlie to save her family. Charlie and Carol were both charged with first-degree murder and murder while committing a robbery. Since both were being tried as adults, both faced the prospect of the electric chair. The prosecution chose the murder of Robert Jensen on which to try them, since it had the most potential to shock and outrage the jury. Elmer Scheel was the prosecutor. Charlie's trial began on May 5, 1958. He did nothing to improve his prospects. He maintained that he was completely sane while his lawyers were trying desperately to cobble together the makings of an insanity defense. Nevertheless, his defense lawyers entered a plea of innocent by reason of insanity. To Charlie and his family, the stigma of being insane was worse than the stigma of being a cold-blooded murderer. T. Clement Gaughan and William F. Matulett were appointed by the court to perform the difficult task of defending Charlie. Somehow they had to try to show that Starkweather was completely insane, whereas the prosecutor had an comparatively easy task to demonstrate that Charlie was sane when he robbed and killed Jensen. Initially, Charlie told the authorities that Carol had nothing to do with the crimes. His first words to them on the subject when he was being taken to the jail in Douglas, Wyoming were, "Don't be rough on the girl, she didn't have a thing to do with it." As time went on and Charlie realized that Carol was trying to position herself as an unwilling hostage instead of his girlfriend, he began to implicate her in the crimes. He suggested that she was responsible for several of the murders and all of the mutilations. "She could have escaped at any time she wanted," Starkweather said. "I left her alone lots of times. Sometimes when I would go in and get hamburgers, she would be sitting in the car with all of the guns. There would have been nothing to stop her from running away." One of the defense attorneys, with a gift for acting, Clement Gaughan, made a very emotional plea. "This boy is a product of our society. Our society that spawned this individual is looking for a scapegoat. Carol Fugate should get the same punishment as this lad, and I can tell you right now that she is never going to get the death penalty. His life, my life, are almost parallel until our 19th birthday. I stand here and weep unashamedly. I hated everybody and everything, and I could lick anybody. Society treated me exactly as it treated Charles Starkweather, but the good Lord gave me possibly a little better parents. I will take you to the death house so you can see him with his trousers cut to the knees, with his arms bare, his head shaved, with electrodes attached, and when the switch is pulled, you will see the electricity snap and the smoke come from his head, his hair stand on end as the electricity goes through his body. You will see him jerk in the straps and see him fall forward. This is your responsibility, not mine. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you for the life of Charles Starkweather." Unfortunately, Gaughan was not Clarence Darrow. Charlie was neither Nathan Leopold nor Dickie Loeb, and there was a jury of 12 people, not just a judge, to make that decision. The jury made its decision within 24 hours, guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. The men and women of the jury specifically asked for the death penalty. Their request was granted on June 25, 1959. Starkweather was executed in the electric chair at the Nebraska State Penitentiary in Lincoln, Nebraska, at 12:04 a.m. At Carol's trial, the defense was built upon her being a hostage, forced by Starkweather to go with him on his murder spree. It was not a very credible defense, and she, like Charlie, was found guilty of murder on November 28, 1958. Because she was a 14-year-old girl, she received a life sentence instead of the electric chair. She was sent to the Nebraska Center for Women, where she served her sentence until her parole in June of 1976.